The wind dragged low across the plains, dragging dust behind it like an old, bitter memory. It pulled at the dry weeds and set the loose tin of the abandoned rail shack to rattling. Clouds hung heavy, like they might snow or burst open and finally scream. But they didn't. The sky just loomed. She stood beside the tracks, still. A wide-brimmed hat, too large for her head, shaded her face, but nothing could hide the ruin in her eyes. Her dress, once a gentle cornflower blue, was now the color of ash, tattered at the hem and streaked with soot. In one arm she held her baby, limp and silent, head nestled into the crook of her neck. Beside her, 2 boys, one not yet 10, the other just older, stood barefoot in the dirt. The youngest clutched a wooden spoon and nothing else. The older boy's shirt was torn at the collar and hung from one shoulder. Their eyes were empty of questions now. They'd asked them all. The train had left an hour ago. Its noise had gone long before the dust settled. There had been no goodbye, no name called out, just the clatter of departure and the slow, cruel return of silence. She had nothing in her pockets. Her husband had died in a boarding house bed 2 towns east, a bottle beside him and not enough left for burial. She had sold the boots off his feet to pay for the tickets. But the man who promised to meet them in Wilford, her husband's brother, a cattleman with some land, had never come, had never written, not once. Maybe he had never meant to. Her fingers curled tighter around the baby. The child did not stir. Behind her, the wind lifted the corner of a worn-out handbill stapled to the depot wall. It slapped once, twice, like a lazy applause. She didn't turn to look. She'd seen it already. Wanted, dead or alive. Men's faces drawn in rough ink, eyes like bullet holes. A wagon creaked in the distance. She didn't move. The wheels ground slow over gravel, and the creaking got closer. A horse snorted, heavy-footed. Leather reins gave a faint groan. Still, she didn't move. There was nothing left to defend. She had already counted the ways she might die: by thirst, by the cold that came down like iron at night, or just by the emptiness that had taken up residence inside her chest. The wagon stopped. Bootsteps landed on dirt. She didn't look up, not even when the man stood within arm's reach. She could smell horse sweat and hay. His shadow blocked the sun from her face, and still she didn't lift her head. "You waiting for someone?" the man asked. His voice was low, rough as stone. Her throat worked, but she said nothing. A pause. "That your family?" he asked then, eyes on the children. She looked at him then, not at his face, but at his hands. They were big, work-worn, veins raised like rope. He held his hat in one hand, respectful. She nodded once. The wind pulled at her skirt. "Where's their pa?" Her lips trembled. "Dead." The man looked down at his boots. He nodded once. A long breath passed. Then he looked toward the open land stretching out behind him, dry and wide and hard as bone. "My place is half a day north," he said. "No roof to speak of, but I've got wood stacked and a pot of stew that'd stretch." He paused. "You can ride in the wagon, or not, but it's getting cold." The older boy stepped forward, his hand reaching out, not toward the man but toward the horse. He touched its leg, then looked back at her. She hadn't wept since her husband died. Not when they'd lowered his body in a borrowed hole. Not when the agent had told her the ticket was only good to Wilford. Not when her youngest had coughed blood onto her dress the night before. But something inside her cracked now, quiet and sharp, like the breaking of ice. The baby stirred against her chest. She blinked, then nodded. "All right," she said. The man didn't smile. He just reached for the older boy's shoulder and gave it a light squeeze, like a man does to a colt that's been broken too soon. Then he turned, walked back to the wagon, and climbed up. She lifted the baby higher, adjusted her grip, then took the boys by the hands. Together, they followed. The man didn't speak as they rode. He gave her a blanket and poured water from a jug into a tin cup. The horses plodded on, and the world behind them shrank to dust and memory. One of the boys asked, quiet and afraid, "Where will we go now?" The man glanced over. "Home," he said. With me. The road ahead was not easy. But it was a road. And for the first time in days, the sun came out from behind the clouds and laid its hands gently on the land. The house was barely more than a shack, squatting low in a hollow where the wind didn't bite so hard. The roof sagged in the middle. One shutter hung loose, tapping against the wall like a finger trying to remember something. No fence, no porch, just hard-packed dirt, and smoke curling weakly from a bent stovepipe. He pulled the wagon beside the structure and jumped down. His boots hit the ground with a thud that made the baby flinch. She held the child tighter and followed slowly, the boys trailing behind like shadows. Inside, it smelled of smoke and earth, with a faint edge of salted meat. A single room stretched from wall to wall. There was a cot in the corner, a small table, one chair. A pot still simmered on a blackened stove. The man knelt and stoked the fire without a word. She watched him, uncertain. "You can sleep in the bed," he said, not looking up. "Boys too, if they all fit. I'll take the floor." She hesitated at the threshold. Her legs ached from riding, her feet numb. The baby had fallen asleep again, limp with the weight of exhaustion. She stepped inside. The boys sat first, slowly, their eyes wide. The older one ran his hand across the wooden table like he didn't quite believe it was real. The man dipped out stew into tin bowls. It was thin, mostly beans, with a few pieces of something chewy but hot. He handed one to each boy, then offered a bowl to her. She looked at it, then at him. "You don't have to," she said, voice low. He shrugged. "I know." She took the bowl. They ate in silence, broken only by the quiet scraping of spoons and the hiss of fire. When the boys finished, they curled together on the cot, their faces already slack with sleep. She rocked the baby gently in her lap and finally spoke. "What's your name?" He didn't answer right away. He stood and poured himself a cup of water, drank it slow. Then he said, "Elias." She nodded. "I'm Ruth." Another silence passed, heavier this time. Elias moved to a small chest and pulled out a folded blanket. He spread it on the floor and lay down without fuss or noise. "You got people?" she asked. He stared at the ceiling for a while. "Used to." She didn't press. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a coyote gave a lonely call, and the wind picked up against the far wall. Ruth looked around the room again. No photographs, no crosses, no books. Just what was needed to live, and not a thing more. The baby stirred, and she rose to settle the child beside her brothers on the cot. She sat there a long time, watching them breathe, their chests lifted slow, peaceful now. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "I could be trouble." Elias didn't move. "Could be." She looked at him. His eyes were closed. "You're not afraid?" she asked. "No." "Why not?" He opened one eye. "A woman with 3 children and no boots ain't a threat, and if she is, well then I reckon I deserve whatever comes." Ruth almost laughed. Not quite. But something softened behind her ribs. She lay back beside the boys and pulled the thin blanket over them. It didn't cover everything, but it was more than they'd had last night. The baby sighed in her sleep. Ruth closed her eyes. The wind cried outside, but inside the shack it was warm. She did not trust him yet. Trust was earned, not given. But she had not eaten this much in days. Her children were safe, at least for tonight. And the man had not touched her, not once, not even his eyes. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought of the road behind them, miles of dust and heartbreak, and the strange, ragged comfort of this place. The man named Elias, breathing steady on the floor. She didn't know what would come next. But for now, she had a name, a place, a bowl of food in her stomach, and a fire still burning. It was enough to survive the night. If you've ever stood at the edge of despair, subscribe and see how the road bends toward light. Morning came gray and sullen. The wind had settled, but cold clung to the windows like breath. Ruth woke to the sound of wood being split. She sat up slowly, muscles stiff, neck aching from the way she'd curled around the children. The cot creaked beneath her, but none of them stirred. The baby slept on her chest. The older boy had his arm thrown protectively over the younger. She rose and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The room was colder without the stove going. She opened the door a crack. Elias stood by the woodpile, sleeves rolled, steam rising from his back like smoke from a forge. His axe came down hard and sure, splitting logs into even halves. No hesitation in his movements. Each swing was precise, practiced. She watched in silence until he paused, sensing her. He turned but didn't speak. "I can help," she said. He nodded toward the side of the house. "There's kindling to stack, if you're up to it." She set the baby down between the boys and stepped outside. The air bit at her skin, but it woke something she hadn't felt in weeks. Her legs still ached, and her shoes were worn thin, but she moved with purpose. Elias said nothing as she knelt by the smaller pile of wood and began to gather. The work was slow. Her fingers, still tender, struggled with the cold. Splinters caught in the pads, but she didn't stop. Elias kept chopping. When he finally set the axe down, he wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at her. "You worked before?" he asked. She nodded. "Cooked, sewed, cleaned rooms, tended goats, once." His eyes held her for a moment, then flicked toward the hills. "I've got chickens, and a mule. Little garden's gone to weeds, but it'll come back in spring if we get good snow." "You live here alone?" "I did." Something in his voice caught, faint and fast, but she didn't pry. He took the kindling from her arms and set it in a dry bin by the wall. "You don't owe me anything," he said. She tilted her head. "I didn't think I did." A smile, small and dry, flickered across his face. They went inside. The boys were awake now, curled around the baby, still silent. Elias handed each of them a piece of cold cornbread from a tin, then took a bit for himself. "Do they talk?" he asked. "They used to." He nodded, like that made sense. They ate, and afterward, Elias showed the older boy how to check the mule's hooves. The boy followed him outside with quiet curiosity, eyes fixed on the animal like it might explain the world. Ruth watched from the doorway. Later, when the baby was napping and the younger boy was dozing in a sun-warmed patch on the floor, Elias asked, "You ever worked leather?" "A little," Ruth said. He went to a shelf and pulled down an old, cracked saddle, its stitching coming loose in places. He laid it on the table and offered her a curved needle and a spool of waxed thread. She sat without a word and took the saddle in her lap. Time passed slow and quiet. Elias brought her tea made from dried herbs. It was bitter, but warm. She drank it gratefully. That afternoon, the boys helped gather eggs. Ruth cleaned the hearth. The baby cried, once, and she held her close, whispering nothing words into her hair. Elias took nothing from her. He made no move to claim her space. He simply shared it, and in doing so, made it hers too. That night, when the fire burned low and the children slept again, she said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked. "I don't know. A man who wanted something. Most do." He looked at the fire, not her. "I've wanted things," he said. "Didn't get them. Still here." She studied the lines around his mouth, the scar near his left eye, the way his hands stayed still when he wasn't working. "I want to earn my keep," she said. "You already are." She swallowed hard. "Even so, I want more than to be kept alive." Elias nodded. "Then stay, not as a guest, not out of pity. Stay because you choose to." She did not answer, but she did not turn away either. Outside, the wind had died down. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt like something settling into place. Snow fell that night, quiet, steady, no drama to it, just the soft hush of white settling over the world like a clean sheet laid across a broken table. Ruth woke early. The air inside was warmer now, the stove still alive with embers. Elias had fed it before dawn. She could smell the char of fresh kindling and something faintly sweet, boiled oats, maybe, or corn mash. She sat up slowly, her arms heavy with the weight of sleep and children. The baby had grown warmer, pink returning to her cheeks. Her breaths came easy. Ruth kissed her forehead before easing her down and stepping away. She dressed quietly and went outside. Snow covered everything, but not thick, just enough to make the land look strange. The trees were bare bones reaching skyward, the garden rows were gone under a white crust, and out in the small yard, Elias was cutting a path with a flat-bladed shovel. He didn't see her at first. She watched the rhythm of his arms, the way his shoulders moved under the wool of his coat, the surety in his steps. The man worked like someone who didn't know how not to. "You should have woke me," she said. He paused, straightened, leaned on the shovel. "You were warm." Ruth came down the steps and took the shovel from him without asking. He let her. They worked side by side, clearing the yard and a path to the chicken coop. The cold turned her fingers raw, but the movement helped. Her body had been still too long. It needed the ache. Inside the coop, they checked for eggs. The chickens made soft noises, shifting in their roosts. Elias reached under one and pulled out 3 warm eggs. "They'll slow down come deep winter," he said, "but they keep enough for 1 meal a day, more or less." Ruth held 1 egg in both hands, feeling its fragile heat. "I forgot how good real eggs smell," she said. Elias glanced at her. "You're good with quiet." She looked up, brow furrowed. "Most folks talk too much, fill the air with noise so they don't have to hear what's underneath." "I've heard what's underneath," she said. "Don't need reminding." He nodded once, like that settled something. That afternoon, she mended the saddle in full, stronger than before. Elias tested the leather by hand, tugging along the seam with something like quiet respect. "Good work," he said. She nodded. It mattered more than she expected, hearing that. The boys spoke that night, just a little. The younger one whispered something to the older, who let out a breath of laughter, sharp and surprised. Elias looked over, but said nothing. At supper, Ruth asked Elias where he was from. He told her Nebraska, though he hadn't seen it in 15 years. His folks were buried there, and a brother too, lost to fever in the mines. He spoke of them like stones dropped in a river gone, but the current still shaped by their passing. She told him about the Kansas town where she'd grown up. Her father had taught her to shoot a rabbit clean before she turned 12. Her mother died birthing a child that didn't live long enough to be named. "We stayed poor," she said, "but we stayed." He offered her another piece of cornbread. She took it, even though she was full. That gesture, simple, quiet, generous, did more to warm her than the food. Later, while the children slept and she sat near the stove patching a rip in her son's only shirt, Elias reached for a wooden box from the shelf. He opened it and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He set it down gently. Inside was a fiddle. Ruth blinked. "You play?" Elias nodded. "My mother taught me. She made me swear I wouldn't forget." He tucked it beneath his chin and tuned the strings with quick, practiced fingers. Then he began to play. Nothing grand, just an old tune, slow and full of longing. The sound filled the room like sunlight, through clouds. She closed her eyes. It had been so long since she'd heard music not from memory. When he finished, he set the fiddle aside, quiet again. "I never asked," he said. "What were you hoping for, when you got on that train?" She stared at the fire. "Not much," she said. "Just a place where no one looked at me like I was already a burden." Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. In the silence, Ruth felt something begin to shift. Not quickly, not like falling, but like ground warming beneath frozen feet. Winter thickened. Snow rose along the fence posts, drifted into corners, softened every sharp edge. The world turned white and still, like it was waiting. Inside the house, the days took shape around small rituals. Morning began with fire and bread, eggs when they had them. Elias would check the mule, chop wood, mend the fence where the wind tried to break it. Ruth swept the floor, boiled water, kept the children clean and warm. The baby grew stronger. Her color returned, her cry sharpened. The boys began speaking again, not just to each other, but to Elias. The older one, Silas, asked questions about the mule, about the tools in the shed, about the way Elias tied knots. The younger boy, Henry, said very little, but he followed Elias everywhere. Sometimes Ruth would look up and find the boy sitting by his boots, just watching, quiet and calm like a pup. One afternoon, Ruth caught herself humming. She stopped, startled, as if she'd spoken something forbidden. The sound hung in the air, and Elias looked up from the stove where he was stirring beans. "That a hymn?" he asked. She nodded, cheeks warming. "My mother sang that," he said, "back when Sundays still meant something. Mine too." She turned back to the laundry, but the moment lingered. They spent more time talking now, in the slow hours after supper. Never idle chatter. Elias didn't waste breath. But when he spoke, it meant something. He told her how he'd once worked cattle from Texas to Montana, how he'd been shot in the thigh near Cheyenne and stitched it himself with whiskey and thread. She listened, sewing by lantern light. One night, she asked him why he stayed here, alone in a hollow where no one came. He shrugged. "Wasn't meant to stay alone. She died." Ruth said nothing. The pain in his voice wasn't loud, but it was deep. He stared into the fire, jaw working. "I built this house for her," he said, "board by board. Took me a year. She never saw it finished." "I'm sorry," Ruth said. He nodded, but didn't look at her. "I buried her near the hill. The marker's gone now. Wind took it, but I still know where." Ruth thought of her husband's grave, or rather, the memory of it. She'd never been back, never planned to. "I didn't love him," she said, not softly. "He was cruel, most days. The boys were scared of him." Elias looked over, face unreadable. "He married me out of convenience," she continued. "I stayed for the children. I left because I had to." Elias stood, poured more tea, and handed her the cup. His fingers brushed hers, rough and warm. "You don't owe me your story," he said. "I know, but I want to tell it." That night, she slept without waking, for the first time in months, maybe longer. As the weeks passed, they built a rhythm. Ruth learned to tend the mule, how to spot early frost rot in the root cellar. She patched Elias's coat, stitched a new hem into the boy's pants using thread unraveled from old feed sacks. When the stove smoked too much, she cleaned the flue without being asked. Elias, for his part, began leaving small things for her, an extra piece of kindling set near her feet, a tin of dried apples on the shelf where she'd find it. Once, he fixed the loose strap on her shoe, quiet as a ghost, and set them by the door before dawn. Still, nothing was spoken. One morning, after a hard freeze, Ruth went outside to bring in the wash and found Elias already out by the fence. He was staring at the trail that led down toward the pass. She followed his gaze. "Hoofprints. Company?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. They stood silent for a while. "Could be nothing," Elias said. "Could be someone passing through. But it might not be." He looked at her then, serious. "If you want to leave, I can help you get to town. Ain't more than 15 miles. I got enough coin for a wagon." She frowned. "Why would I leave?" He didn't answer. She stepped closer, voice low. "I didn't come here to hide. I came because I had nowhere else. But now this feels like something I could build on." Elias looked away, his hand clenched around the fence rail, knuckles white. "I want to stay," she said, "but only if it's my choice." He nodded once, slow. "It is." Ruth let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Then she turned and headed back inside, the sound of her boots crunching in the snow. Behind her, Elias stayed by the fence, watching the trail. By the time the stranger came, the snow had turned to crust, hard enough to cut. The wind carried ice in it again, and clouds pressed low on the hills like waiting fists. Ruth saw the rider before Elias did. She was at the chicken coop, gathering the last of the eggs, when she spotted the figure at the ridge tall in the saddle, wrapped in dark wool, horse moving slow and heavy through the ruts. She didn't panic. She just watched, eyes narrowed, and waited until the rider crossed the draw and started down toward the house. Then she walked inside and said calmly, "There's someone coming." Elias didn't ask questions. He stood from the table, crossed to the cabinet, and took down the rifle. He checked the chamber, loaded 2 more rounds, then set it by the door. The boys stiffened but didn't cry. They knew now this land taught them fast. Elias stepped outside, while Ruth drew the children to the back corner, pressing them close, her own heart steady but loud in her ears. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence followed. She heard Elias speak. One word. Then another voice answered. Low, male, strained with travel. Minutes passed before the door opened again. "It's a lawman," Elias said. "Name's Connor. Out of Gray Fork." Ruth stepped forward, holding the baby. "What does he want?" Elias looked back toward the man still on his horse. "Says he's tracking someone. Man who deserted from the militia. Could be passing through. Does he think it's us?" Elias shook his head. "No, but he's asking around. Wants to know if we've seen anything." She felt cold rise up her arms. The baby whimpered, sensing it. Elias saw the flicker in her face. "We've done nothing wrong," he said. "We have nothing to hide." She didn't answer. Not right away. Then, "Let me speak to him." Outside, the rider was tired. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and one boot was wrapped in cloth where the leather had cracked. Ruth stepped out slowly, the baby still bundled against her. "You've got children here," the man said, voice softer than expected. "I do." He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, I won't take much of your time. I'm following a man named Roy Hatcher. About 6 feet tall, scar under his jaw. Been traveling west. Might have had a woman with him, maybe children." Ruth stared at him. The name was an old nail in her spine. "I knew him," she said. "He's dead, 3 months now." The man blinked. "You sure?" "I buried him." Silence. Then, "Wasn't much good, was he?" "No," she said. "He wasn't." The lawman didn't argue. He just nodded, looked toward Elias. "You've got a decent place here," he said. Elias gave a non-committal grunt. "Snow's coming again," the man added. "Mind if I warm by the fire before I ride on?" Elias opened the door. The man came in, careful not to track too much snow. Ruth handed the baby to Silas and brought the kettle to boil. No one said much, just the scrape of boots and the sound of heat rising. The lawman sipped tea from a tin cup. His eyes lingered on the children but didn't pry. "You planning to stay?" he asked Ruth after a while. She nodded. "I am." He looked to Elias. "That good with you?" Elias didn't blink. "It is." The lawman smiled, faint but real. "Then I'll be on my way." Outside, the snow began to fall again. Light, feathery flakes, the kind that disappear on skin. He mounted up, nodded once more, and rode into the cold. Ruth stood in the doorway, watching his figure shrink into the white. Elias came up beside her, hand resting lightly against the doorframe, inches from hers. "You all right?" he asked. "I am now." She closed the door. Later that night, she pulled out the fiddle from the shelf and handed it to him. "Play something," she said. He hesitated. "Please." Elias set it under his chin and played soft, slow, something that sounded like hope disguised as sorrow. The baby slept. The boys leaned against each other. Ruth sat beside him, close enough their shoulders touched. Snow whispered against the windows, but inside there was warmth, and a feeling she had not known in a long, long time. Belonging. The snow stayed for 2 more weeks, drifted high against the door, froze the pump near solid. They melted water on the stove and rationed the root vegetables down to the softest turnip, but no one went hungry. The hens still laid, and Elias caught a jackrabbit in a snare he'd long forgotten he'd set. They weathered it together. Mornings began with shared labor. Ruth split kindling with steady hands now, her swing sure, her back strong again. Elias taught Silas how to oil the rifle and keep the stock dry. Henry learned how to feed the mule without spooking it. Ruth taught them all to mend clothes tight enough to keep the wind out. It became more than survival. It became routine, life, stubborn and simple. And still, nothing passed between her and Elias beyond what was needed. He never touched her, unless by accident. She never asked for more than what he offered. But something lived in the silences. A look passed across the room, a hand brushing against hers when he handed her the ladle. One night, when the baby coughed so hard she turned red, Elias sat with Ruth beside the cot for hours, holding the child's hand, rocking her gently with a tenderness that felt too big for words. When spring broke, sudden, muddy, wild, Ruth felt the change before the first thaw. The wind smelled different, the birds returned, the sky pulled higher. She was outside, sleeves rolled, scrubbing soot from the window panes when Elias came around the house. His boots were muddy, his shirt rolled at the sleeves too. "There's a traveling merchant in town," he said, "bringing seed, tools. I was thinking of going." She squinted up at him. "You want company?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Wouldn't mind it." "Boys too?" He grinned a little. "Wouldn't be right without them." They left the baby with an old widow 2 farms over. Elias had fixed her roof before the first frost, and she was grateful enough to return the favor. The wagon ride into town took over 2 hours. Silas rode up front with Elias, quiet but alert, while Ruth sat in back with Henry tucked under her arm, his face pressed to her side. She hadn't seen a town since the day the train left her behind. Her stomach twisted as they neared Wilford's Edge. But it wasn't like before. Elias drove straight and unhurried through the narrow streets, nodded to the blacksmith, waved at the feed shop clerk. He belonged here. And beside him, Ruth didn't feel small. She felt like part of something. They bought seeds, a sack of beans, a new pair of boots for Silas, and a tin of honey, just because. Elias picked out a bolt of blue cloth and handed it to Ruth without a word. She touched it, stunned. "What's this for?" "You said you used to sew." "I did. But I've never had fabric this fine." He looked down, almost shy. "Figured you might make something nice for yourself. Spring church, maybe." Ruth didn't answer right away. She just held the cloth to her chest and tried to swallow the lump that rose in her throat. They stayed until sundown. On the ride home, the boys dozed in the back, curled up like pups. Elias handed Ruth the reins and leaned back against the wagon rail, hat low on his brow. "You did good today," he said, quietly. "So did you." Another silence. Then he cleared his throat. "There's something I want to ask you. Not now, but soon." She looked at him, heart quickening. "Why not now?" He glanced over, eyes serious, but soft. "Because I want to ask it right. When the ground's dry. When I've cleaned up this house and planted enough to feed us through summer." Ruth smiled, a slow, aching smile that started deep and reached all the way to her fingers. "All right," she said. "I'll wait." Back at the house, as the last light faded over the hills, Ruth stepped out onto the porch and watched the wind move through the thawing trees. Inside, the boys slept. The baby stirred in her cradle. Elias stood by the stove, stirring water for tea. Ruth turned to him. "You can ask me now," she said, "if you want." He looked up. The kettle hissed, and the space between them filled with something vast and gentle. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, one hand still on the kettle, the other loose at his side. The fire crackled low behind him, casting long shadows across the floor. Ruth waited. Elias took a slow breath and set the kettle aside. He looked down, then back at her. "I'm not a man of speeches," he said. "I know. I've buried more than I've built, lost more than I've kept. But when I look around this house now, it don't feel like a place meant for ghosts." She stepped closer, her feet bare on the wooden floor. "I don't want to keep you here," he said. "I want you to choose to stay, not out of need, not out of debt, but because it's what you want." Her heart knocked hard against her ribs. "And what if I say yes?" He blinked, caught off guard by her quiet certainty. "Then I'll take that as a vow," he said. "And I'll do right by it. Build more, lose less, for all of us." Ruth's hands were trembling, not with fear, with the strange, unfamiliar weight of being wanted not for what she could offer, not for what she could endure, but for who she was becoming. She nodded. Then yes. Elias didn't move quickly. He reached out like a man asking permission, and when she met him halfway, his hand came to rest gently at the side of her face, calloused thumb brushing her cheek. She leaned into him, her forehead against his. Outside, the thaw had begun in earnest. Drips from the eaves, the soft groan of earth waking up. Somewhere in the trees, a mourning dove called out, low and warm. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. By the next morning, she'd moved her few things from the far side of the room to the shelves he cleared without being asked. Her shawl hung next to his coat. The boys helped him mend the porch. The baby giggled as sunlight poured through the clean windows. They planted together rows of beans, squash, corn, and hope. Elias showed Silas how to press the seeds deep enough, but not too deep. Ruth worked barefoot in the soil, her dress wet to the knees, face streaked with sweat and joy. Henry followed with a tin watering can, serious as a preacher. Weeks passed. The garden took root. So did they. One afternoon, Elias rode into town and returned with something wrapped in a cloth sack. He handed it to Ruth without ceremony. Inside was a plain ring, silver, carved with small stars around the band, not bought new, but polished to shine. She looked up, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "I know you said yes," he said, "but I thought maybe you'd want something to show for it." She slid the ring on and kissed his hand. A few days later, Ruth stitched a small linen dress from the blue fabric he'd given her. She wore it to church on Easter morning, her children beside her, Elias at her back. People stared, but no one whispered, because when Elias walked beside her, it was with a quiet pride that made it clear she belonged. They built a crib that spring, planted more rows than they had seed for. Ruth started baking bread to trade in town. Silas took to the mule as if born to the reins. Henry learned to whistle. The baby said her first word, soft and slurred, but unmistakable. Home. They buried a new post at the edge of the property that summer, marked with a name, Hatcher. Not for the man who died, but for the family that had survived him. Ruth stood beside Elias as they drove the last nail into the sign. She looked out across the land, the house, the trees turning green again. She took his hand, and for the first time in her life, she felt certain, not safe, not lucky, but chosen, and choosing, too. The wind passed through the tall grass and kept going. The sky above was wide and open, and somewhere, just beyond what they could see, the next season waited quiet, promising, full. Do not leave this road alone. Subscribe and walk it with us, step by step.